Hello and welcome to another episode of a Brothers Creed podcast. We're talking about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas Brothers.
And I'm
Ethan.
Jared, and today we're talking about, this is part one of a review of our rights as an American. We are going to look at the Bill of Rights from the beginning. This is part one, so we're going to run through the first, 13 or so amendments. In the original Bill of Rights, there were 10 amendments. But since then, there have been an additional number added, additional 17, all the way to 27. So we're going to cover all of them, do an overview of the 27 amendments in honor of our freedoms as Americans. This is going to be coming out around the 4th of July. And so this is a great exercise just to go through and remind ourselves of some of the rights that we have, and the Bill of Rights is a great place to look, as well as the Constitution, obviously, for many of our rights, and how that has evolved over the years, and we'll talk about that. So let's go ahead and jump in.
All right, let's do it.
Spartans! What is your profession?
Any man who must say, I am the king, is no true king.
What I do have are a very particular set of skills that make me a nightmare.
If I can change, then you can change. Everybody can change.
Let us all unite! Let us fight for a new world, a decent world.
Okay, so I just got to say, the part where Liam Neeson says, I have a very specific set of skills, skills that make me a nightmare. I've been listening to that book, Never Split the Difference, where it's like an FBI negotiator talks about these tactics that you can use to negotiate with people, and I'm definitely learning all these skills.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, absolutely.
That make me a nightmare.
For people that want to get a deal. Or a salesman.
That's awesome. So today, we're going to dive in, and really our goal was to do a breakdown of the Bill of Rights. There's certain, inalienable rights that we have been given by God, right? That some that we have built into the facets of our country itself. So originally there was 1787. There was 55 delegates at a constitutional convention. And this is where the Constitution of the United States was written. And really the purpose of the Constitution was to revise, let's call it like a weaker document that was called the Articles of Confederation, that was held together by just the original 13 colonies, or the 13 states, let's say, after they gained their independence from Britain. But then as the country continued to grow, they knew that there was more needed to be done. So basically what they did is the delegates from the different states, they kind of argued back and forth on if we should have a national document, something that was a binding document. And one of the main arguments was that there was in the U.S. Constitution, there was a lack of specified individual rights and liberties written into the Constitution. And so James Madison actually drafted a set of amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and that's what we know as the Bill of Rights. So it was these individual rights and liberties that the Constitution didn't specifically address, that the founding fathers thought that these are so important that we need to add them in. James Madison actually submitted 12 amendments, but as Jared had said, they only accepted and only ratified 10 of those amendments into the original Bill of Rights in 1791. So since then, there has been an additional 17 more amendments that have passed for different reasons, and those are the ones that we're going to be going through today. Amendment number 1 all the way to 27. And Jared and I are going to kind of jump back and forth. We're going to kind of go through these, and to start off, I'll just say that I loved doing this. because you learn about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence in school, but I think it's almost a subject or a topic that's kind of glazed over nowadays. And I remember talking about it, but maybe I didn't. I don't know. Maybe as a kid I didn't care as much, but I just really like history. And looking back at this is like, why would they do that? Why would they put that in there? And so it's kind of cool. So Jared, you're going to kind of kick us off with the first one.
Yeah, so the first one is a huge one. It's so many things are packed into it. So the First Amendment has to do with the freedom of religion, speech, press, peaceful assembly, and the right to petition the government for redresses. Now, one of the things, Ethan, that I want you to help me with is, as we go through this, is there's so many different things that, as we've talked about in our podcast, we've talked about so many things, and it's like, oh, I remember this from remember this from this podcast episode, or I remember this has to do with this from this podcast episode. And so I'd like you to help me bring some of these things to the forefront, and I'll try to do that too, that relate to other things we've talked about in other podcasts. The first one here is the first part. It talks about freedom of religion. It says the first part of this amendment is called the Establishment Clause, and it says basically that no laws respecting the establishment of religion. So this is what it says: "Quote: No official state church like what it actually says is no laws. There should be no laws respecting the establishment of religion." So that means that there's no official state church like the Church of England. You think about the horrors that happened in Salem witch trials. We just talked about that a couple weeks ago. Yep. And how there was spectral evidence, and how the state and the government was so tainted by what this craziness and this mass hysteria that it really affected the objectivity of the government. And so that was in the 1600s. It does not have an established religion, nor does it base its laws on any religious edict specifically. The next clause there is the Free Exercise Clause. So you cannot be prohibited from being a part of any religion, but that does not necessarily restrict your practice, the religious practices you do. Like if you can believe in human sacrifice, but if you actually are doing human sacrifice, that's a different thing. There's been other things like polygamy and other things where the state will step in. If you have
acted upon those things.
Yeah, if you have like children that you're marrying or whatever, then the state has stepped in. The government has stepped in those situations. So there are restrictions to the practices of your religion. The next one here, the major one, is freedom of speech. So this is really to protect you from an overarching government. So the freedom of speech allows criticism of the government. In history, and even in modern times, many dictators would just wipe you out if you criticize or speak against them. I mean, you think about these like critics of China. I think I remember seeing in the news recently, there was like some critics of China where they were just like walking in an airport and they just got like stabbed by needles in the airport and got assassinated. By these assassins that were just, or Kim Jong-un, he strapped his uncle to an anti-aircraft gun and blasted him into infinity because he disagreed with them. So, particularly a political speech and speech against the government is mainly protected under the First Amendment. So that does not include. So the First Amendment protects you from the government prevents the government from denying you your freedom to speech, but anybody else, they can. So like Instagram or Facebook or your company or your boss, if you go in and just start rattling off to your boss and just saying whatever you want, then you may get fired. And so, like I said, political speech gets the toughest protections. You can advocate force or overthrowing the law, but only if there's no immediate effect. If there's an immediate effect, that can be seen as dangerous speech, almost like inciting like yelling fire in a theater or something like that.
So last month I had finished the book 1984, and it's just really interesting. It had been years and years and years since I had read it, but basically it's this utopian society that is completely regulated in every single way by the government, and they have these computer screens, or these screens in every single house that they record everyone's conversations. They can hear everything. They listen to everything. They see everything you do from the time you wake up to when you go asleep. And they tell you what to do. They tell you your job. They tell you everything. And if you ever speak up against it, you'll disappear. You'll go work the mines, or you'll be completely erased from society. And they have you probably heard some references to this in the news recently, but they have what's called the Ministry of Truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this portion of the government that basically edits any and every historical literature, document, opinion, anything that's ever been said and recorded. It is edited at the Ministry of Truth to say whatever the government wants it to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was a really interesting.
And they just recently came out with the Office of what is it called in the U.S. They just came out with like basically a Ministry of Truth, which is like it was anti-fake news. I don't know.
I can't remember exactly what it was called, but yeah, it was like a whole
Department
committee,
of the government.
Yeah, committee that had put together that was the anti-information, false information group or whatever. But one thing that I was going to say as well is it kind of at the start of this is these only
it's the Disinformation Governance Board.
Oh yeah, that's exactly the Ministry of Truth.
Yeah.
All of these things that we're going to talk about today, they only apply to United States citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think one thing that happens to Americans is we go to other countries, and you're so used to living in the society that we live in that you almost think it's okay to say whatever you want, or to do whatever you want, or whatever else. And you're in, communist China, or you're in somewhere else, and they're like, hey, we don't have those laws here.
Yeah.
You can't say whatever you want, or you can't do whatever you want, or you don't have the right to a speedy trial, or a lawyer,
or habeas corpus
else,
or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So one interesting thing here is that if your speech presents a clear and present danger, the government can correct your speech. So like shouting fire in a theater, or there was a case where a guy was encouraging people to dodge the draft, and that went to the Supreme Court, and it was deemed that he was causing a danger, so they were able to censor him. Or telling people to, like even recently, clear and present danger. Well, if you're telling people not to go get the vaccine, like a lot of these doctors were, well, not a lot, a small minority, you could say that they got censored by the big media and also by the government. These Fauci saying, or these guys are lying and all this kind of stuff. And Fauci's is clean as a whistle, so we don't have to worry about that.
Of course.
Also, there's symbolic speech is also protected. So flag burning is protected. Also, hate speech, what's considered hate speech, is protected. One person's hate speech is another person's regular talk, and so it's kind of, what does the adage go? One person's freedom fighter is the other person's terrorist.
Yeah.
So what one person perceives as hate speech could just be another person's opinion, and so that is the beauty of free speech. And I think it's a shame that in like some of these colleges they have like these safe spaces where you can't you have to be a safe person. You can't like go in there and talk openly or whatever because it's too offensive. Anyway, that's off topic. But as we go to the next portion of the First Amendment, we have the freedom of the press. So this is supposed to prevent governments from censoring the press. So there's different types of one is like pre-publication censoring. So prior restraint or stopping an article before it's published. So an example of this there was a Supreme Court case called Neer versus Minnesota in 1927 when a local newspaper wanted to publish a story that the city of Minnesota was under the secret control of a Jewish gangsters, including the police chief and the mayor. And the police stopped the story, and then a lawsuit ensued, which made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And and it was ruled that the government was not allowed to censor the press because free press is essential to the political system for the political system to work. Now, the idea that the press is meant to protect us from the government overreach, that's the idea. But we know that the CIA has plants in almost every single one of the news organizations. The government pushes propaganda on news stations all the time. So I think that we have deviated meaningfully from this one, and that the press maybe the government is, I think, having influence, and maybe they're not stepping in, but they're stepping in so ahead of time at just cutting things off nipping things at the bud, so that nothing ever comes of it. So that I think the disintegration of this has allowed the government to run wild and out of control in some senses.
Well, I think to a certain extent too, it's almost they get it so early on, like you were saying, that it's almost not breaking the rules of the First Amendment, because it's like, well, if there's a big news organization and we don't want them to say something, instead of censoring them, we're just going to pay them a bunch of money not to say it, or to say what we want them to say. And so that's
why
not
all the news is sponsored by Pfizer.
Yeah, that's not censorship, right?
Yeah.
They're paying them so much money to say what they want them to say and not say what they shouldn't say.
Yeah.
And so it's just this way around, getting around censorship within the media.
Yeah. And so there is a recourse. There's a kind of a balance there, is that if the press publishes something that's untrue, they can be sued for libel. And if the person can prove that what they said was false, they can receive monetary for damages. So this is what happened with Nick Sandmann, who was part of the group of students who went to D.C., the Lincoln Memorial, and they were just standing around, and this Indian guy comes up and starts beating on a drum right in front of them, and then CNN calls this kid a racist, and he was harassing this Indian man, all this kind of stuff. Well, they were wrong, and so he sued CNN, and he
sued a bunch
settled,
of different
settled with them.
He sued a bunch of different organizations, and I don't think we know exactly how much, but millions and millions and millions of dollars.
He said he sued them for $275 million, and the settlement was undisclosed. Also, the Kenosha kid, Kyle Rittenhouse. He was also slandered in the news, and he also was going to go after a lot of these news or organizations for
people calling
lying.
him a mass murderer, people calling him a white supremacist, people calling him all different types of stuff, just slandering him to the point
with
of
no
where
basis.
I think recently he had put on his Facebook or Instagram or something like that, hey, I'm going to be going to this college or whatever, and I really love to go there. And then basically the college answered back and said, no, you're not.
Really?
Yeah. And it's like that literally is impeding his progression in life because of something that the media did.
Portrayed him as, yeah. Yeah. So that's that's a huge one. And then also petition the government for redress of grievances. That one's interesting too, because if you remember back when I talked about little known battles and wars, I talked about the Comanche Nation, and how the Comanche Nation, we made the kind of a deal with Mexico that we were going to just stop having them raid, and they would, but the Comanches were still raiding into Mexico, and they would petition the U.S. government and for redress of grievances, or even people within the United States would petition, say, hey, like these guys are still attacking us, they're still attacking our farms and whatnot, and also, you have the ability to petition the government to say, hey, I need compensation for this wrong that was done to me, and that will be heard out. So that's also an important piece there as well.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and do the Second Amendment.
All right. So, I mean, that first one, that's a biggie. I mean, I think there's a reason why it's the First Amendment. So that one took a little while to get through, but I think there's so many good things there. So the next huge one, just as important, or just next important, is the Second Amendment deals with our right to bear arms or to purchase firearms. Now, this one is actually a very short amendment, and I'm gonna explain why there's a little bit of confusion with it. So I'm gonna read it word for word, but where there is a comma, I'm gonna say the word comma, okay? Because there's so much confusion in this amendment, mainly due to there being 4 commas, and they're kind of grammatically confusing. So this is what it says.
Yeah, there's also commas in the one prior, where it talks about, you have this right, and then you have this right, and then you have this right.
Yeah, so it says, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. So there's a lot of people say the debate is whether the Constitution's framers only had in mind that the militia should have the right to bear arms, or that the individual citizen should have the right to bear arms. There's a group that says, oh, well, it's talking about a well-regulated militia. They have the ones, they're the ones that have the right to bear arms. But if you look at it in the commas, then it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so, this one's just, it's really interesting. And it's probably one of the most debated, at least recently, bill of amendments to the in the Bill of Rights that's out there. And another interesting fact that I'll go through is that in 2008, the Supreme Court actually ruled 5-4 that U.S. citizens have a constitutional right to keep a loaded handgun at their home for self-defense. Basically, this was in 2008, and they agreed, and they ruled 5-4 that said that United States citizens have that constitutional right. And so this decision that they made, this ruling, has come down to majority of people believing that the constitutional right that we have refers to the individual's right to bear arms and not the well-regulated militia and their right to bear arms. So
pretty bold language there. Shall not be infringed. None of the other ones are that outrightly bold.
And you have people that say things like, oh yeah, but they were talking about muskets, right? Do you think the founding fathers would have been okay with 30-round ghost clip magazines?
Ghost clip magazines. What the heck is that? They're ghost magazines. They don't have serial numbers on them.
Yeah. I don't know. That's just what some of the Democrats say. But it's I
fully
think
automatic, fully
automatic semi-automatic rifles. No, fully semi-automatic rifles. What it says.
Oh, yeah, that's what he said.
I personally believe that you go with the technology of the time, right? And they did not know, but it makes sense, right? Whether you're writing in a newspaper article that's going to be printed on a printing press, or whether you're writing a blog post on the internet, the First Amendment still applies. And just because things have changed, just because there's more access to it, quicker access to information, the First Amendment hasn't changed, right? Just because there's bigger guns that shoot faster doesn't mean that the Second Amendment has changed. The foundation and the fundamental right that has been given has been given there. Yeah, maybe there needs to be some regulation around potentially who should have these firearms with felons or people that are mentally unstable, and some sort of verification. But that should be done across the board. You kind of have to grow with the times as well, but still honor the words within the Constitution. And some people say, oh, we should just completely get that one out of there. It's not even pertinent today. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's not completely.
It's absolutely pertinent today.
Yeah.
Just look what happens. Look what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I heard one thing they were like in Miami. They're like, hey, turn your guns into the Miami Police Department and we'll send them to Ukraine. That's like, do you see the irony in that?
Yeah. Seriously.
One of them, I just want to share a quote on this one. Thomas Jefferson said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So how's that going to happen if there's no Second Amendment?
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah. Well, and then people, I'm not going to name any specific names, but they'll get up at the White House and say, what are a bunch of people with guns going to do against civilians with guns going to do against the government with a tank? Well, it's just or
F-16s or whatever.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't know, but
I don't know. We'll just maybe fight for 20 years until you just abandon all your equipment, and then we'll just take that.
Yeah, or you get 100 million people with guns. I think there's like 300 million guns in the United States, right? You get 100 million people with guns, and then you get to the point to where probably 3/4 of the military wouldn't want to be firing on their own people anyway. Yeah, exactly. And so it's checks and balances, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms.
Yep. So let's
listen to our episode about the top 5 guns that every person should own.
Yes, and then we did actually follow up with Toby Gagnon about his thoughts as well. So the Third Amendment is no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So this essentially protects against an army to quarter or just take up shop in your house. So probably one of the least utilized because there haven't been very many wars on American soil. In 1774, the British passed the Quartering Act that allowed soldiers, they could just take any room in your house if they wanted to. So obviously the people didn't like that at all. And it has to be, you have to have consent to do that. And so that's, they couldn't just kick you out of your house. And so that's what that one's for. Some of these are going to be quick.
Yeah. Interesting little fact on that one. You kind of hinted at this one, that the Third Amendment is the least litigated amendment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if I didn't say litigated, or did
I said that. This is something that I had found, that the Third Amendment is the least litigated amendment, which there has been less trials or litigation, legal issues with that one, probably because we haven't had a war on U.S. soil since.
But even
the War of 1812, maybe, I don't know.
Well, Civil War.
Okay, Civil War, true. Yeah, Civil War.
But yeah, it's interesting how it even says in times of peace or in times of war, without, but it says, but in a manner prescribed by law, which usually involves the consent of the owner of the house. You can't just take their property. Yeah. So,
well, what's interesting is you see sometimes in these, and these are just the movies, right? But you see sometimes in the movies the government just rolls through the town and the army, and they just take up quarter or whatever, and they just, go wherever they want, and they're like, this is our town now, or I don't know, maybe that's more like an apocalyptic type situation.
Well, you know why? It's because that is sometimes during a martial law scenario. And I'm going to talk about martial law a little bit later, and which of your rights is suspended during martial law, and the Third Amendment is one of those.
Okay, all right. So we won't spoil that one. So the Fourth Amendment deals with searches and seizures. So the Fourth Amendment prevents the government or police from searching or seizing the homes, belongings, or bodies of citizens without probable cause or a warrant. So basically it says that the right of people to secure their own persons, houses, papers, effects, or things from unreasonable search or seizures shall not be violated, is what it says. And no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. And so this is kind of interesting because there's been some things that some other laws that have been implemented that are what was that the one that was like free to frisk or something like that?
Oh, it was the New York one that was done by Giuliani. It was like stop and frisk, where they just stop random people and they frisked them.
Yep, they could just stop you and frisk you, and if they found anything on you, then boom, you're going to jail or whatever.
Which was seen by many as being racist, because they were just like, hey, you need to stop, and I'm going to frisk you.
Yeah, and that the whole issue with that was that there was no probable cause. How could you have probable cause without seeing somebody do something, or without seeing an object or something like that? And so if there's no probable cause, then there'd be no reason to stop me. Yeah. And this one gets really interesting because you see all these like they call it like the First Amendment auditors, and even like Second Amendment auditors, that they'll say these people on YouTube, they'll go out and they'll go and they'll try to go into a government building and just record. And they they'll say, you can't
call themselves auditors.
Yeah, you can't have cameras in here. And they'll be like, no, I'm an independent journalist and I'm auditing I'm doing a First Amendment audit, right? And they'll say, so give me your camera, give me this, so give me that. And they'll say, no, you don't. This is a protected under the Constitution, that you don't have probable cause. Or they'll someone is walking in open carrying or something like that, which is you carry a firearm in plain view, which is legal in most states, but
holstered or in a
non-threatening way. It's just holstered. No, but you're not touching it, you're not messing with it. You're just walking down the street, and then a cop will come up to you and they'll say, whoa, stop right there, and they'll detain you and take your firearm and everything. And they say, well, what's your probable cause? Like, why did you stop me? Oh, it's because you have a gun. Well, that's not, just because I have a gun doesn't mean that you have probable cause to stop me. And so this one's kind of interesting. It can go in lots of different ways. Another interesting fact about this one is one of the most significant impacts of this amendment was in a court case of Weeks versus the United States in 1914, where the Supreme Court decided that evidence taken in violation of the Fourth Amendment could not be used in court. So, whenever in these police shows, and they say, well, how did you get that piece of evidence? Did you get that without a warrant? And they say, yeah. And they go, oh, well, it's not admissible in court then, because you didn't get that piece of evidence through a warrant. And so it kind of protects people from being maybe even railroaded to a certain extent, against being their property and everything just being taken or seized without any warning or cause.
Yeah, this one's interesting because I recently was reading about a new thing that was passed by I think it was by the Supreme Court, that says that the federal government can now conduct like warrantless stops and searches within 100 miles of a U.S. border, which includes the coastlines. So, and it's supposed to, I think supposed to be for like, trafficking or like immigration types, or like to crack down on smuggling and stuff like that. But that still could be a threat to the Fourth Amendment, which protects you from such type of illegal searches and seizures. Yeah. That's why you see on these cops that are on like YouTube and Instagram and stuff, they're like, if the cop asks you, hey, can you open your trunk? Say, nope, I don't consent to searches and seizures, searches of my property. Unless they have probable cause, they can't do that. But if they ask you, you say, yeah, go ahead and check it. Then they will check it. But if you don't have to say, yeah.
And that's the thing too, is a lot of people, they'll say, hey, can we search the car? And people will say, well, do you have probable cause or do you have a warrant? And the cop will say, no. And they'll say, oh, come on, well, just let us search your car. If you don't have anything to hide, then there's no issues, right? The cops will kind of trick you and say they'll try to Brendan Dassey you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so then a lot of times, and this is, right, quote unquote speculation, but then the cops will say, this is mostly like maybe for a traffic stop or something like that. If you won't let them search your car, then they'll say, okay, well, you'll have to wait here until we can get a canine unit to do a search of around there outside of your car. And so they'll have a canine unit, so a drug smelling dog that'll come. And I have seen 30 videos of this, but the cop will lead the dog all the way around the car, and the cop will like tap on the window or something like that, and the dog will go up and put their paws up or do whatever. And they'll have like signals where they'll make the dog alert. Yeah. And then if the dog alerts, then boom, probable cause. And now they can search your car with however long or however whatever they want to do, because the dog, quote unquote, alerted, quote unquote.
Yeah. Which
I'm sure that's happened some way or another, but that's kind of one way. I'm in support of police officers, and I back the blue, but I think that there are definitely some people that maybe take their authority, maybe a little bit too, what's the word I'm looking for?
Abuse of power
to the authority that they have. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, interesting, like immigration officers, they can detain you with just a reasonable suspicion, which is even lighter than probable cause.
Yeah.
So
it's like, oh, is that marijuana I smell in your car? Oh, is that? I smelled alcohol in his breath for sure.
Oh yeah.
Suspicion.
Yeah, that's where you get tricky. So did you have anything else on that one?
No. So that's number 4.
So the Fifth Amendment really sets the stage for the Sixth Amendment. And so this one says that no person shall be held to answer for capital or otherwise infamous crime unless a presentment or indictment of grand jury, except in cases of arising from land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service or in time of war or public danger. Except for a person in active duty, you cannot be arrested for a crime without a warrant from a grand jury. So what this kind of talks about, unless you're in the military, the military has its own code of conduct, which is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And you have the certain rights in the military, and then certain rights as just a regular citizen, that you cannot be held without for a crime unless you are given unless there's like a warrant for your arrest. There's also another part of this Fifth Amendment that says, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. So this has to do with double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime twice. Now, if you remember back to we did like famous con artists, right? I talked about some of these famous guys. I talked about the Ponzi guy and how he was tried for certain crimes, and then later he was actually tried for different crimes like mail fraud and these other things because they were just trying to get him as much as they could. But then he sued back and said, well, this is double jeopardy. You're trying me for the same thing. Like, oh, well, technically this is just mail fraud and these are different charges. So those are some of the rights there. In addition, it says, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So this is a big deal. In many regimes, they'll just torture you until you confess, or they'll say that they'll kill your family, so they make you testify against yourself. I think it's
so like a forced confession.
Yeah, which is basically what happened with Brandon Dassey, like you mentioned earlier. They basically forced a coerced confession out of this kid who was just a minor with mental issues.
Yeah, and they forced it out of him with leading questions.
Yeah, and so also your wife cannot testify against you.
Really?
You know that? Yeah. I learned that from Better Call Saul because they didn't want to be in a position where his girlfriend could testify against him for any of the shenanigans that he was doing. And so they got married so that she would not be, so that she could say, well, I can't testify against my husband, and that's allowed. This next part here says, of the amendment says, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So some have claimed like this part is like reminiscent of like the 10 Commandments, like the government can't just steal from you in these different ways without it being just, or without giving you just compensation. So
you just raise your taxes.
Yeah, and then raise your gas prices and then everything else.
Yeah.
But actually in times of war, there are certain provisions where like the government can come in. That's what during martial law, they can come in and seize your, this is one of the things, like they can come in and seize your food,
your assets,
seize your ammo, seize whatever they can and redistribute it as they wish. So I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later.
Interesting. So the Sixth Amendment includes the right to a speedy trial. So it kind of relates to the fifth one, the one you just talked about. But I'm going to read the first line of this amendment. It's kind of interesting because I circled one word that I found really interesting. So the amendment actually says, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Like it used the word enjoy. Like
that's funny.
The accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. So I just thought that was interesting, the word enjoy. So
yeah.
So this is the
well,
right,
because in other countries they'll just keep you indefinitely.
Yeah,
and you have no idea why you have no idea why you've been arrested.
They won't even tell
what's
you
going on, and you're just in jail.
Yep.
Did I tell you? I think I've told this story before about my neighbor. He knew a guy in Cameroon, and the guy got arrested. He had no idea why. He served 7 years in prison, and one day they just came by his cell and knocked on his cell and said, "You can leave." And he said, "Can you tell me why I was arrested?" And they said, "Do you want to stay longer?" And he just left. He had no idea why he was in jail the whole time. 7 years.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So this one talks about a couple of rights. The first one is a right to a speedy trial. The second one is by an impartial jury. And you have the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witness against him, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So basically it guarantees people accused of a crime a fair and accurate criminal proceeding. That is the right to a speedy public trial by jury in the area that the crime was committed in. The right to confront and question witnesses against them or people that have accused them. The right to subpoena or require people to have them come and testify. And then the right to a lawyer. I thought that was really interesting because what really qualifies as a quote unquote speedy trial? In 1791, maybe it was a couple months, right? But in today's court system, there are guys that are in prison for years until they have a chance to get in and actually have a trial. Now, I think they are given the kind of the reasons why they were
Arrested.
They
They're
were
given all that
arrested
reason.
in the first place, but the actual time to get to trial in many cases is years.
Well, I wouldn't say
so
years. I mean, I think there's probably a general timeline, but years before you can get a trial. I think that's excessive.
I think there's some people. I think there. Well, I know for a fact. I don't think it happens a lot, but I know there's some people that have been in like county jail for waiting to have a waiting for sentencing for a year.
Wow. It's crazy.
And I don't know the reason behind that. I think maybe in some areas that there's a backlog, or maybe it's somebody they just don't want to deal with, so they just kind of push it.
But you can get out on bond. Maybe their bond is just too high; they can't pay their bond.
Yeah. So, well, we're going to talk about that in the Eighth Amendment.
Oh, nice. Well, in the Seventh Amendment, this is about. It says in suits at common law, where the value is in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of the trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise reexamined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of common law. So this one is really about non-criminal law. So the government is basically not a party in these cases. So it's not like the state of Minnesota versus so-and-so. It's literally Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, in a criminal. This is exactly one of the cases. We talked about how in Hatfields and McCoys, how they would sue each other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, they were in a court over whose pig it was that one of the
stole a pig. Yeah,
someone stole a pig, and they went to court over this, and they would sue all the time over these things, and they would have that right to a jury. Now, at the time, it was set for $20. That amount has not been amended. Inflation, that would be about $579 in 2020. Probably $20. In $2022 is probably $1,000 because of the inflation that we've just had. But the price is, I mean, it's just essentially it's like if there's anything material. I mean, I would even say $20 is really immaterial, but you have that right. I think there's a small claims court you can go to for a lot of the smaller stuff, but then the bigger stuff, like if you're suing someone for $50 million, like Johnny Depp was, and then Amber Heard countersued him for $100 million because they said, well, it's just double that. That's how much damages she had.
Why not?
That's what they said. So that is the right. So it also extends the right to. Let's see if I have anything else here in my notes. It has a lot to do with property rights. So property rights factors in a lot here over property disputes and stuff like that. So yeah.
Interesting. So the Eighth Amendment prevents the government from imposing cruel and unusual punishments on criminal defendants. So this is a very short one. It says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And that's all the amendment says. So it's interesting, really just prevents them from imposing too high of a bail and saying, or denying bail in some cases. Now, I think there are certain instances where they do give the judge some liberty. And I know that in some cases they can deny bail. But this is so the bail or inflicting cruel or unusual punishments on criminals. And this is where there are a lot of people that argue that the death penalty actually violates the Eighth Amendment because they consider that to be a cruel and unusual punishment. And so that's why there's been lots of confusion and arguments around the death penalty. And does it fall under that umbrella of cruel and unusual punishment?
And what about waterboarding?
Yeah, well, the thing is too is that so one of the reasons why the United States is Guantanamo Bay, right? It was outside of the United States was because potentially the Eighth Amendment did not apply to, I guess, facilities that were outside the United States, and it had some kind of weird regulation how it just didn't qualify for this. So there was lots of stuff and cruel and unusual punishments that went on there, that kind of skirted around this. But yeah, waterboarding kind of is one of those
I think the CIA deemed it not cruel and unusual, or they decided it wasn't, or maybe the courts did. I can't remember exactly. And so that's why they were allowed to use it, and then later it was banned. So that was one of those hotly debated punishments, because technically you're like, well, it's not that cruel. They're just drowning, or at least the illusion of drowning. It's kind of unusual, but it's just like
definitely cruel potentially. But I think too, it depends on, and maybe this is just my opinion, and I haven't given much thought to this, but I think it depends on the reason, right? If you're just if someone's just in prison, are you trying to coerce a confession out of somebody, or are you trying to get information on somebody, some terrorist cell that's going to bomb an airport or something like that? Right? Mm-hmm. Are those two situations the same? Somebody in prison, or just who's on a drug offense, who is acting up, and they'd waterboard him, versus like a terrorist who has intel and specific information as to things that are going to happen. I don't know the answer to that question, but
it's definitely a blurry line.
Yeah.
So let's see what's next. The Ninth Amendment. So the Ninth Amendment is it says the enumeration in the Constitution, Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So basically what it's saying is that the rights that are enumerated here should not be construed that people don't have other rights as well. So it's kind of a vague, people have referred to it as just an ink blot, meaning you can read into it whatever you want. There was, at the beginning, there was like the feds and the anti-feds, kind of when the Constitution was being put together. The anti-feds wanted to write down what freedom meant and like what freedoms you had. Now the feds, which consisted of Madison and Hamilton, they said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. Hamilton had said that by writing down our liberties, we limit our liberties to what is written. And I think we've kind of gone down that path in a lot of ways, because we just keep adding more and more amendments, and it's becoming very letter of the law, especially when you think about the Supreme Court and all these considerations and all this stuff.
It's kind of the letter of law versus the spirit of the law a little bit.
Yeah, so it's like if I say you can't, or I say you can, if I tell my kids you can play inside, and like that's, but they're like, well, what about all the other freedoms that we have? Like, is this the only thing we can do? So is this the only thing we can do?
Just because I said you can play inside doesn't mean you can't play outside.
Yeah. Just because I listed with some of your rights doesn't mean I have to list every single right. It's like in the scriptures where it says, like, I can't list all of the ways to commit sin, but there are many ways,
Yeah.
Just because I haven't listed doesn't mean it's not a sin. So interesting here is that in response to that argument by Madison and Hamilton, they did the Ninth Amendment, saying that even if it's not written down, there are still other rights retained by the people. So the idea, some of the modern interpretations of this is that, like, for example, gay marriage, people would say, well, because the people believe that this is a right, then therefore it is under the Ninth Amendment, even though it's not enumerated under the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment can be seen, like I said earlier, as an ink blot. You can read into whatever you want. Another way that people read it is that another thing that can be categorized under the Ninth Amendment is the right to privacy. Is one thing that is not specifically enumerated. I mean, you could say that having your property safe from searches and seizures is part of that, but specifically privacy, especially in the modern age, you could lump that under the Ninth Amendment, with digital privacy and whatnot. So, that's the Ninth Amendment.
Interesting. So the 10th Amendment, this is the last one that was incorporated into the original Bill of Rights, right? The first 10. And this one keeps the federal government limited. This one's a short one as well. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So what that means is that any powers that are not specifically assigned to the federal government are basically the responsibility of each state. Mm-hmm. And so this amendment protects against the possibility of a national government assuming all powers and saying, everyone can do this or can't do that, and just kind of getting a national power. And I think we see this sometimes with, let's say, marijuana, right? There were some states that marijuana was legal, and there was other states where it wasn't legal. And there was different punishments, and it was kind of left up to the states to make that determination. Now, I think recently, did they have some kind of federal ruling in marijuana usage? Maybe they didn't.
I don't think
I know
so.
I know it's been talked about, but that's just an example of where the government or the national government hasn't particularly had an assigned power or law at that point. So they've allowed the states or the people of those states to make the decision. And so that one kind of limits that national government power, which I think is important. Because if you have just one massive group of one small group of people that are making decisions for the massive United States, I think it gets a little bit dangerous. I think that's one thing that makes the United States so great is the diversity of people that exist and that live in the United States. And with that, you're going to get many differing opinions. And you can see that, Oregon or Washington has a little bit different political stance than maybe Georgia or Texas, right? And if you stand more with one or the other, then you can go live there. And you can align yourself with a state that maybe has more aligned with your specific views. So that is the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, so that is the conclusion of the original 10 amendments that were from 1791, which is when the original Bill of Rights came out. And so now we're going to do the first three into the new ones that have come out since. So the first one is the 11th. The next one is the 11th Amendment. This one came out in 1795. This one is, well, I'll just read it first. It says, the judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity, commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by its citizens of another state, or by citizens of subject of any foreign state. So it's kind of confusing, but really what I think what it boils down to, based off of what I've researched, is that early on, if someone had a grievance against a state, they could just sue that state, but the state had something that was kind of that was people knew from England. It was almost like a sovereign immunity. This notion of a sovereign immunity in general was not unfamiliar to Americans, and so there was a guy early on, Robert Farquhar, who sued the state of Georgia for money due to him, but the state refused to show up to the thing, and so it claimed that it had sovereign immunity, and it could not be sued unless it is explicitly agreed to be sued. You can't sue me unless I agree to be sued. And so it was what this was. The Supreme Court in this case rejected the idea of sovereign immunity and extended to the individual states. Instead, it ruled that Article 3 of the Constitution, the provision of the Constitution establishing the federal courts, essentially acted as a blanket waiver of the state's sovereign immunity. So basically ratifying the Constitution that the states had actually given up whatever immunity they had previously enjoyed. So they no longer had that sovereign immunity, so they could be sued for grievances. So that's what that one's about.
Interesting. So the 12th Amendment talks about really it changed the presidential election process. Now this one's a little bit longer, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gets into to basically updates as to how the president and the vice president are elected. So this amendment was ratified in 1804, and it changed the election process laid out in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. And so this is a real true amendment because they're making a specific change. And it fixed several problems that came up because of a couple different developments in the political atmosphere of the United States, one of which was political parties, and also the effect that the Electoral College had on the election. And so reading just a little bit to sum up the amendment itself. So first off, it says that each state will vote for the president and or vice president independently, and that they will take those votes and they will count them, and then the winner of those will be basically it says it will be sealed and transmitted, sealed, and sent to the government. And so they'll send it to the president of the Senate, which you got to think in the early 1800s. I mean, they didn't have like all the technology that we have today, so it had to travel. It was sealed probably with a wax seal and sent off to the president of the Senate, who will present it in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so it says that the person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed. So this is where they kind of bring in that electoral college, right? That's dependent on the population of the state, that the candidate or that the person came from, or where the votes came from, that if, the larger states obviously had more electoral votes than not. And so a president would have to win the majority of the electoral or the electors appointed to become president. And then it says basically the same thing for the vice president. And this was passed in response to the 1800 election between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, because it ended in a tie. And so they introduced some changes to the process, including the electoral votes, so that a tie would not be possible. So that was kind of an interesting one.
Aaron Burr's the one that killed Hamilton in a duel.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So the next one here is the 13th Amendment, which is a big one. The 13th Amendment is when it has to do with the abolition of slavery. This is in 1865. So just to bring you a couple of years earlier, in 1863, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. So that was a quote from the Emancipation Proclamation, which he made in a way freeing all those slaves, although many of them did not even know about this until later, which is when they celebrate the Juneteenth holiday, which has to do with when many slaves were in a certain area, certain slaves were made aware that they were actually granted their freedom. But this amendment to the Constitution was in 1865, so it's about 2 years later, where it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So pretty straightforward. Unless you're a criminal, a convicted criminal, involuntary servitude and slavery is not acceptable. And I think that is excellent. One of the landmark. This one in the 15th. There's some. Some of these ones you're like, what is that even, like the 11th Amendment? You're like, what is that even about?
Yeah.
But this is definitely one that's a major deal in our history as a country.
Yeah. I completely agree.
And with that one, that puts us about halfway, right?
Yeah.
So we are going to do part 2, where we go through 14 through the end. So this is the end of this section. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. We've shared a lot of good stories. Hopefully you've enjoyed this crash course on the Bill of Rights. And
just let the podcast play. Just go ahead and play the next one.
Yes, exactly. So thanks for listening, and let's join us in the next one.
All right,
guys. Let's build that creed together.
Let's do it.